everyone. For those of you and those that are with us online, it's our pleasure to welcome Moussa Blimpo from the World Bank and the Mexico to have him with us today, telling us about this asymmetry in civic information, an experiment on tax participation among informal firms in Togo. And this will be our last seminar for the semester, so it's a real pleasure to have you here today to do this presentation for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katia, and your colleagues for giving me the opportunity to come here and share some of my work with you. I must say that I'm not actually totally new to this place, and it's fantastic that there is this home to researchers working on Africa, the NOVAFRICA program here. I was here a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, I think, in one of the most engaging conference on Africa. So I'm very glad to be back here. So today, what I'm going to talk about is joint work with my co-author and friend Paul Dower, who's at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And this work is this work is really about the big picture question of how the government engages with the often large informal sector in the developing world, and in this particular case in Togo, and particularly on their effort to tax that segment of the economy. And what we're doing in this paper is something relatively simple, because who talk about informal sector, we'll talk about a lot of information gaps, information asymmetries. And what we're doing here is to fill one aspect of that information asymmetry, in particular on the firm owner side and their knowledge on the tax code, and see how that impacts the engagement on the taxation effort on that dimension. Now, this is a particularly big question because the informal sector is often quite large in many emerging and developing economies. We're talking about 70% of total employment by some estimate. We're talking about 80% of the enterprises, and these are data from the World Bank and OECD research centers. And in the particular case of Togo, where this study is run, they did a recent, the first ever census of enterprises and economic entities in the country. And it turns out 86% of all the economic entities, enterprises, are actually operating in the informal sector. So that's where the people are. Now, granted, this is not necessarily the largest contributor of the GDP. It's often around 1/3 of the GDP, and in some cases 40% of the GDP, but that's where the people are. So a lot of these people are earning relatively low level of revenues and low level of income, right? So, and the motivation for the state to engage with that segment, if we're talking about 86% of enterprises, so then the state often see that as an avenue for fiscal tax revenues, right? But the research, what we know about that is that it's not straightforward, that would be a major source of revenue for the state, right? Some of the work by Laporta and Schleifer in 2014 did a very nice overview of this work and showed that the vast majority of these firms are often very low revenue firm, unproductive. So it's not clear how much revenue you'll be able to raise on that front. On the other hand, there are some work, including in this very part of the world where we're running this study, that were commissioned by the World Bank in 2012, that showed that a number of these informal actors are actually quite large, contrary to what one might think. So it's a mixed picture in terms of how much revenue can be raised by aggressively pursuing tax revenue. But even beyond that, as development economists, we also care about institutions. We care about how the state interact with the citizen and how the fiscal contract, the social contract could evolve, be strengthened over time. So even that aspect that aspect has also received a lot of attention, including some work by, so there's a nice book by Wilson Pritchard, who cover how that plays out around the world in the developing and emerging economies. And some of the recent work by Jonathan Wiggle, who's at LSE, does a lot of similar work in the DRC, has also shown how the outcome variable may not necessarily be only the revenue mobilization dimension. And of course, Beasley and Pearson have a series of papers that shows that these two are actually linked, right? Building the institution require fiscal space to build state capacity and create legitimacy over time. So there are at least two good reasons why, whether it's the revenue side or thinking about building institution, the social contract, why the state is interested in engaging with that sector. And as a result, there is a long-standing formalization agenda in this part of the world. And the formalization is really trying to do that, to be able to capture this segment of the economy under the umbrella of the state, whether for raising more revenue or other reasons, control and many other reasons can be put forth for that. But the default agenda, including in the policy arena, is really finding ways to get this sector formalized. But if you are trying, I think I'm not in full screen. Pardon me. Let me see how I can do this. Okay. View full screen. Okay, that's much better. Okay. So, but if you are trying to formalize and tax the informal sector, that's going to be challenges. And one of the challenges by definition is the very idea of asymmetry of information. There's very little record keeping. These are also the poorest part of the population, a lot of time, low level of education. So there will be excessive cost of enforcement as well, especially if you consider the cost benefits of raising that tax revenue. But a lot of these actors are also operating really at the subsistence level, right? And if they are operating at the subsistence level, it's not even clear that they want to be in that profession, that they want to be formalized. You know, they're trying to make and meet. And that's why if you look at the carefully calculated unemployment numbers in some of these places, it will look like there is no unemployment at all. Because if you ask somebody whether they have a job, they will say, no. Have you done anything the last whatever couple of weeks to earn some money? The answer is that's going to be yes, but there's no alternative. There's no social safety net. And so people have to engage in economic activity, right? So you don't want the taxation to create distortion that could have a devastating welfare effect here, because if they are really operating at the subsistence level, falling short even just a little bit means going below, going through some significant hardship. And this picture on the right is one of the pictures that we've seen a lot at that time when we preparing this work. We've seen a lot of that in Benin, in Togo as well, where these small economic entities would get closed because they failed to pay the taxes. And that's not in the interest of anyone. You know, the state isn't making any additional money by closing them, and they are not making any additional money for their family or being able by that in that process to pay their own taxes. Right? Yes, please.
So just on this point, I think this is the point you're making. I agree with that. Like the cost benefit of like going after small businesses with taxes is, I think, kind of ambiguous at best.
Yeah.
Most of the literature that I've seen in this space looks at like property taxes and stuff like this, like where, you know, maybe it's an easier target, I guess, because first of all, the capital is non-movable, and second of all, because these are people who like they're rich enough to own property and we think they might.
Exactly.
Yeah, like the welfare implications are a bit more straightforward.
Yeah. What
led you or even the government here to want to study these small businesses? I think it's a really interesting population, but like, what was the logic behind trying to devote resources to getting tax revenues out of these guys? A lot of them are operating in subsistence level.
Well, I don't think the government approached them as entities that are operating at the subsistence level. I think that may be, first of all misunderstood, and that's part of the, I think, part of the contribution we are putting on the policy space by discussing this issue, right? They see them as economic operators, all right? And then they go out there and try to raise revenue, either municipal revenue, or in this case, even central authority revenues, right? Now, part of the reason why you will also see that both Jonathan, including this work also, we're looking at the extensive margin. They go out there, they don't, everyone is supposed to pay taxes, but they don't actually end up taxing everyone. Our baseline numbers is like 40%, right? You're supposed to pay. So if I can get you, why can't I just take money from you? So I think the government's approach is just one of focusing overly on that first part, trying to raise revenue. And then it's statutory required for every economic entity to pay some of these taxes. Yeah. And then if they can reach you, they take the money. And then we think there are potential distortion going on, and that we need to discuss in this case. As a researcher, what we approach this on thinking more on the welfare side of this. You know, we thought a little bit more, we thought a bit less on the public finance side, which is a very important side, but you know, this kind of pictures and our qualitative, original qualitative work, just understanding what these economic entities go through is what prompted us as a researcher to be engaged. But the government side, I can't speak for the government, but based on what we see, I think it's more about we need to raise revenue. They're supposed to pay. I go out there, if I can find them, I get the money. Okay, so so there will be these challenges as a motivation. So in Togo, for example, right? So you have a tax code. This is just a tiny snapshot of the tax code. It's a giant document that has all sort of rules, right? So most firms do not know the basics of the code. What am I supposed to pay? They just know that somebody may show up and then ask me a certain amount of money that I need to pay. If I can't pay, I need to bargain, or I need to find a way to get out of that situation, or I need to pay part of the money in some other ways, right? So they don't know what to expect, right? They are allowed, they're normally supposed to voluntarily go and declare their revenue and then be taxed based on that revenue. And if the government disagree with the declaration, then the government can do an audit. And I would expect that most of the time they wouldn't do an audit. Somebody just actually goes there and make a declaration, right? So goes and take a break until the tax official is tired and moves along, right? So the process of collecting taxes in this sector itself end up being a little bit informal itself, even from the state side of applying the law in a way that is highly informal. But if they were to show up and try to then collect the taxes, they will estimate the revenue based on a range of factors that is defined by the law, including the appearance, especially the asset. So they use the asset as a proxy for the revenue. But what they're really targeting is the profit. Based on our conversation with the official, they're targeting the profit, but they can't observe the profit. They use revenue to us to basically have some sense of that, but they can't observe the revenue. So then they use the asset, the location, how big the firm look like, to infer the revenue and then tax that revenue. So that's sort of the big process that's going on here. I'll get to you just in 1 second. And this is one tax that is a national tax that all economic entities need to pay. And this tax apply actually specifically to the informal sector. It's called tax professional unique, unique professional tax. It's a synthetic tax that is like taking into account income tax, VAT, and all the other factors into one tax. And then if a firm pays this, then they don't have to pay all these other aforementioned taxes. So it's a synthetic tax that is 8.5% if you are operating in the services, 2.5% if you're selling good or producing some goods, right? And then, I apologize, this, yeah.
Sorry, that's 8.5 and 2.5% of revenues.
Yes, exactly. So, sorry, this is French, so I almost spoke French right there. So, chiffre d'affaires will be basically the revenue. It's not the profit because they can't observe the profit. In fact, they cannot observe the chiffre d'affaires. Yeah. But they have to infer that based on these things, which then give disproportionate bargaining power to the tax official when they show up. And no, the tax official knows this. None of these firms will know this. And then that's basically trying to give you a little bit of the context before I go too much in the detail. Please, you had a question.
So I was wondering, what is the consequence for informality? So if you are informal and you start paying taxes, are you becoming informal? And what is the difference of being informal?
Yeah, exactly.
Taxed versus formal?
Yeah, so that's the other thing that's often a little bit misunderstood in this part of the world, because informality is often associated with some form of illegality. It's actually not in most of these places, right? Informality is more of the degree to which the economic activity can be traced and measured and tracked, right? Now, in the particular case of Togo, the government has actually defined formally what informality is. It's like if your revenue is below certain amount, and I'll talk about that later, it was around 50,000 US dollars, you are classified legally as informal, right? So you are small economic activity equal informal. And if you are informal, this is the part of the tax code that apply to you. And everyone, whether you're making $1 or $49,000, this will apply to you, and you need to know this, and this need to apply. But then what you will see is that the vast majority of the firms who are informal are also skewed to very, very low level of revenue. You know, not even 1/3 of that $50,000 per year that we're talking about. So that's the specific context of Togo. Now, in Togo, what would be formal would be that you have a formal ID called carte d'opérateur économique. Like, you know, if you want to operate economic activity in the country, there is a formal registration that gives you an ID. You enter the system, so there are rules that you need to follow to have that. Even that would not make you formal by the tax code if your revenue doesn't exceed that threshold. But then if your revenue exceeds that threshold, by law, you need to hire a certified accountant, certified by the state, to keep track of your economic activity. And that certified accountant will be part of your tax filing process. Does that make sense? Okay, so some of these are unique to Togo, but the part that is less unique is the low level economic activity, the informality, tracking, and the way they are being taxed. A lot of time, there's a lot of
So formal and informal doesn't discriminate to additional services that I might, if they exist, that I might access. So because if you say that a lot is informal, it means that, you know, if I'm informal in many countries, paying the taxes doesn't give me any rights. But in this case, I assume that paying taxes means that you can also have rights. Yeah, so here everyone is supposed to pay taxes. And I think it's the case in, I don't know all the countries in Africa, but in Ghana it's the same, in Benin it's the same. Mm-hmm. You are supposed to pay taxes, formal, informal, whatever. If you don't pay, that's tax evasion, right? So the formality, the degree of formality that we should be thinking about really is either the size of the activity or the traceability, the ability to have any meaningful information about what economic activity is actually going on and how to tax that economic activity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just had a side comment on, I mean, you're saying that the threshold is 50K of revenue, but revenue is not exactly observable in all cases.
Yes.
So that's, I guess that's not a very firm.
Well, it can be firm. It cannot be firm.
On
yeah.
paper, but
yeah, exactly. And that's why, you know, when my co-author and I started working on this, we realized that, I mean, there's a lot to learn here, right? That's why this is one specific paper, but we're thinking about a bigger picture in terms of how to engage with that 80% of the economy, right? I'm really sorry. It's just that if I was home now, that would be the time to go pick my daughter. And I should have turned this. I turned this one off. I forgot to turn this one. Yeah, off. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so that's the big thing. And I think the context matters a lot here, even to make sense. You know, in some places we present this paper, it's like, what does it even mean not to pay taxes? Why are you even looking at the extensive margin? Like, yeah, but because 40% only pay taxes and they were supposed to pay, right? And then I presented it in South Africa and there was no such question. It was like, yeah, we're dealing with the same issue here. In fact, we made a law not long ago to exempt completely the very low level economic activity from any taxes and focus more on supporting them to. So it's a little context specific, but it speaks to a bigger problem that is relatively widespread in most of this part of the world, right? So again, you know, and these are taxes if you're using vehicles in your firm and stuff like that. So it's a much complex tax code that is there, and you cannot by any stretch expect that these people will understand what their obligations are.
So, but
Yeah.
then, so if things are based on assets and observable assets, I mean, some businesses are not going to be taxed because they don't have much visible assets. So there should be a big distortion for that reason. And also that 2.5 compared to the 8.5 makes me think about that. 8.5 is probably because this is more difficult to observe. So,
I didn't ask about that. In fact, that's a big, sorry for the interruption. Maybe you were not done. Yeah. So first, I think this is something, and I can find out what is the rationale why this should be much higher. But it's not only the asset also. It's like even the part of the city you are operating, you know, how, you know, some are even, some are mobile, okay? And they will use like your means of transport as a proxy. So if you're operating, are you walking or are you using a bicycle? So they're using all sort of things, right? And again, I think that's why this is a vast area for us to help government think about, you know, what really makes sense in terms of how to engage with them. So for those who don't have asset, they use a bunch of other proxies, right? But again, you can expect massive distortions in the way the rules are even applied. And what we are talking about here is really even really the way, the lack of consistency in which the tax official themselves may be applying the rule. I think that's in itself is a big issue. So again, what we're doing here is just looking at one dimension, okay? We want to train the firms on the tax code to ensure that we alleviate a little bit of asymmetry of information on that side, because the tax collector knows this information. They are trained to apply this process, but the firms don't know. So we'll train them on that, and we try to look at how that affects the tax participation. Right now, here in formulating the question, I talk about the tax code, but here is in the tax code, I will include also the one dimension of fiscal, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The fiscal contract, because in this particular part of the world, again, people don't see the value of their tax money in terms of services that they receive. If you talk informally to people about, you know, why we pay tax, what is that money for? You know, people will talk about funding politicians or corruption, and then they will stop there. But the reality is much more complex. Money is being used to pay for a bunch of public services, even if the corruption is also there. So we thought it was important to bring these two together in the same message, and I will talk about the details a little bit later on. Yes, please. Yes. The vast majority of these firms are self-employed, owner-operated firm, and I will show some example for further context when I get in the details. Right, the vast majority of them are like one-person firm, and some of them will have apprentices who come and learn, but others will have eventually temporary workers here and there. But in terms of employing some other people on a permanent basis, very, very rare to see such example, right? So I was told that this may be a 1 hour, so I thought I should preview some of the findings before I get into a little bit more detail. So what we did is an RCT. These firms are largely in the informal sector in the capital city. One treatment, one control group. I'll talk about the details of the sampling at some point, because again, no sampling frame, but we have to find a way to get some degree of representativity. We'll talk about that. And so we provide rigorous training on the tax obligation and how the tax money is used for public services. Then we measure the outcome of the intervention at the end of the tax season, looking at the tax participation, because we do have some data, but we do not anticipate that we'll be able to get good information on the actual tax collected, because we were not also coming to this from the perspective of the government, but that's the main thing the government is interested in, right? Then we look at the economic activities of these firms. So what we found is, first we document a large improvement in their knowledge. We even got, and I'll talk about that when I'm talking a little bit about the mechanism later on. We got some super positive feedback, some informal through the trade union, where they were like, this is amazing. We never knew about this kind of information, like not even from our treatment group. So they took it to their peers, and then the information was circulating, so there is a demand to know some of these, the basics of the tax code by this firm, right? So it decreased participation overall. High revenue firm would pay, and then the low revenue firm resisted more. And on the next, the extensive margin, the participation dropped by some magnitude of 5 to 13 percentage points out of a base of 40 or 41% who paid at the baseline. We do have some evidence suggesting that this may enhance economic activity of the firm, because when you document how they avoid paying taxes, you realize that it has impact on their economic activity as well. So they have to go in hiding. They don't know exactly when the tax collector is coming. So they have to, but then if they are empowered to resist, you could expect some effect on their economic activity. So we will document, yeah, please.
Measures of corruption. Do you have?
Measures of corruption, we don't have much beyond the self-reported. We ask their perception about the process, so they did report that to us. But it will be hard. We try to ask them, did you pay a bribe and this kind of thing. It's so hard to get that in any meaningful way. We do have some information on that.
Well, my guess would be that it's primarily an anti-corruption intervention. So the bargaining power of the firms are increased in terms of paying bribes.
Yeah, so that's what we would also think. So the effect on the extensive margin, by some stretch, we could argue that is a decrease in bribe payment, because a lot of time we actually document. I'll show that much later. We document some evidence on condition on the tax being face to face with the tax official. So it didn't self-declare. So, and then I will show you later how in the treatment group, the percentage who end up paying is much lower. It's like 80% in the control group. When the tax official shows up, you end up paying something. Whether what you paid is a tax or a bribe, we cannot say for certain that whatever is being paid is going in the government coffers. Because again, this is very early. This is our first work on this, and we wanted to have a program working on this issue going forward. So we approach this from the perspective of the firms trying to reduce the distortion. So we cannot claim in terms of revenue what really happened, but when we rely exclusively on the self-reported, it does look like we could even make a case that the total revenue could potentially increase under certain conditions, but we can't say that for certain. So, and of course, even though I would discuss some of the mechanism, I mean, this is an RCT, we didn't design it to elicit the specific mechanism through which this work, but we did serious qualitative work to help us understand how this is actually playing out in practice.
Sorry,
Yes.
You have the amount that people pay, the firms pay.
Sorry, say that again.
Self-reported, right? So what people say they pay. And you don't know whether it's bribe or the official payment.
Yes, and then we also did something that didn't serve us later on. In fact, I could say that
you
we
could have the data from the system on official payment or not.
Sorry, say that again.
You could have the actual tax paid or not.
I could not. I could not, because again, these people don't have what I said earlier, carte d'opérateur économique. They don't have that. So I cannot even use administrative data unless the tax authority really work with us for the RCT. But the part they work with us is really to ensure the messaging, that we all agree that the messaging is the right one. But what we did that we wish we didn't do was that in collecting the revenue, we asked that they show us receipt, right? So then we have a lot of missing value, and so what I would show, anything I show about the revenue is based on the one that we've seen the receipt, and it's relatively smaller sample, but we were lucky that it's split even in the treatment and control. We show that, but we're not putting any big weight on that because of the way we collected that data. I think we should have even asked, anything that they report, even if we don't know whether it's actually tax payment or the bribe to avoid paying the tax.
So you're saying there's no treatment effect on the likelihood that firms show you a receipt?
Oh, no. There were
What you said about business spread, was it the baseline or follow?
Yeah, that's the follow-up. There's no, I mean, I think it was like 57 observation, 30, 27. Like, I mean, we didn't bother even to test whether that difference is significant or not. We just wish we had better data, but we didn't, we wish we didn't ask for a receipt, which then led to a lot of missing observation on that particular.
Right, but what I'm saying is, like, by asking for a receipt, whether they show you a receipt or not, that's an interesting binary outcome.
Yes.
It sounds like you're saying there's no treatment effect on that outcome.
Yeah, I would think there will not be a treatment effect, but I didn't run it in a regression. I'm just looking at how we split. It was relatively even.
Okay.
Yeah, there wouldn't be a treatment effect on that. Yeah. You had a follow-up question on that?
Sorry, I was just saying.
Yeah.
Because I think it's
Yeah. So, so in terms of contribution, we also see two buckets here. We think this whole space of taxation, especially if we are going to focus on the informal sector, we can claim that there's very little that's done there. But even in general, in more general, there's very little. There is a growing now work that's being done, but relatively little compared to where we need to be. Some of the early work were a lot of lab kind of experiment. There's more growing field experiment in many settings. A lot of time using mechanism to enforce also the tax code on firms that are already under the umbrella of the state, in looking at different, what type of information will work, whether coercion or persuasion, invoking people's patriotism, trying to find mechanism to get compliance. And I think we contribute to that literature with this added angle of the extensive margin and the focus on the informal sector. But another bucket of literature about information transparency and building up accountability for service delivery in poor country. There's also a lot of literature last nearly 2 decades now that look at different ways to do that, and often with very mixed results. And in part because the poor don't have bargaining power, and you just giving them information so that they can claim something from the elite, but they can't claim it really in reality. And sometimes they don't even have the capacity to absorb that information to be able to claim it. Some of this work I've done myself in education, looking at empowering the local community in the school management, right? But you ought to be able yourself to be literate, to know how the curriculum works, to be able to hold the teacher accountable. So we go and train these communities to hold teachers accountable, but like they don't know the school production function and how to make that happen. And even if they did, a lot of time the teacher is one of the most influential people in the community. So it's very hard to hold them accountable. So we think what may be working here in our favor, and that could inform that line of literature as well, is that in this particular case, by default, the poor is holding the right? Like they hold the information about their revenue, and it's about giving something. It's not about trying to get something from somebody powerful. So maybe they're more able to stand for that, because worst scenario case, you just don't have it, or you can say you don't have it. So there may be a new room there to look at that that literature from that different angle as well, and looking at the right versus responsibilities from the bottom up. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the presentation is to go a little bit more in detail on the context, the methodology. I'll show some of the results, and then I'd like to reflect a little bit of what this may mean in terms of policy and the kind of work we may need to do more going forward in this space. So for the context, this is NOVAFRICA. I don't need to spend too much time on explaining details about Africa, but this is specifically Togo, and the work is happening in Lomé. Is important. Everything I will say would apply to in the numerous African countries in which you produce knowledge on. Usually the capital city is a large chunk of the country. Here we're talking about over 1/4 of the population, but 63% of the firm in the census are actually in the capital city. That's a large large number. Togo is a relatively poor country compared even by West African standard, with a per capita GDP less than 1,000. The tax to GDP ratio is particularly important. Now, our economy has been, like many do recently, has been debased to capture both the informal and a lot in the digital that has developed in recent years. So that bumped up our GDP in a significant way overnight. Otherwise, this number, tax to GDP ratio, it exceeded 20% at some point, right? So Togo still is one of the countries that is doing, I wouldn't say better, but that is mobilizing more revenue. Now, mobilizing more revenue should be a good thing in principle. So in most of the countries around the coast, the capital cities are typically at the coast, and it's a large share of the economy. So they will share that similarity. The population of interest are these, tailors, hairdressers, carpenters, mechanics, a lot of small economic activity, but that helps sustain life and economic activity in that part of the world, right? Usually little to no formal accounting, not registered. The firm that will qualify as formal sector will be excluded. I thought about 50,000 K. We keep changing this number based on the exchange rate. We should just keep the exchange rate of that time. So it's in the local currency is 30 million CFA, right? Like that's basically the amount of revenue you need to have to qualify, above which you qualify as a formal sector, and then you are then required to keep a formal accounting, right? So I talked already about the synthetic tax, 8 and 2%. There are also multiple municipal taxes. Now, to give you a little bit more context, using the baseline survey, we have a descriptive paper actually comparing Togo, Ghana, and Benin, because we collected similar data across the border. So firms in general don't disagree that they need to pay taxes, and therefore barometer data does report that as well. People in general think taxes should be paid. 41% at the baseline reported paying the taxes from the last tax season and tax collection. When asked about the factors that affect the tax bill, 24% basically flat out say they have no idea. They just have a bill and they have to figure out how to get out of it or how to pay it, right? But of those who reported some rational justifying their tax bill, over 2/3 of them reported things that are about the appearance of the firm, the number of apprentices, the value of the asset, but a lot of their asset. But a lot of time they don't actually link this to revenue. They don't link this to profit. They don't see these as proxy for what they make. They just see that they just think it's unfair to be using these factors that remain, that is fixed from one period to the next to determine their tax bill in many cases, right? In terms of firms who actually have the carte opérateur économique that are like under some other definition will then qualify as a formal, it was 8% of them, of the sample that had that card, right? But that doesn't make them formal in Togo. It just make them have a documentation with the state. So with some permission, this is just to give you an idea of the people we're talking about. So this is a carpenter on top left there. So he's there. There will be some orders to make somebody want a table or somebody want a bed, which will be a big order for him. And then he will have to buy the wood at that time. So these are not people who have like inventories and making chairs and selling or exporting to other cities, right? You can see there's not much going on around. They usually basically have their tools and this table to then fix some people's chair and stuff like that, right? So this tailor is the very first person we met at the bottom left. He was explaining to us how, if he can anticipate when the tax collector is coming, and if he's not able to close in time to take a break, then the next thing he could do is to make sure that he look less busy. So he said, okay, if I can have this second machine, I think that will have a big impact on my bill. Certainly don't want to look busy with all these orders here. So he will have to try to fix things quickly to affect their tax bill. So the whole collection is informal, right? And then these are mechanics and some of the work that we are also doing. And a lot of time, these people would also have apprentices. So there is a whole informal vocational training that comes with these informal sector activities, right? And a lot of time, these are people who drop out of school as a result of a family shock and they can't pay their school fees. And in fact, we interview the owners, they get in that profession a lot of time the same way these young kids are getting in that profession. So there's a lot of, professional aspiration mismatch in terms of what they're doing now and what they really want to be doing, that it doesn't really make sense that in many cases, we're trying to see how they can formalize, right? Many of them are trying to get out of it if they can, to do something else, right? So these are like example of people and many others, and I think we should include maybe female tailors, like my own younger sister. That's what she does. This is her own work. So it's a large segment of the economy. It is it's a highly informal. They are supposed to pay taxes. Now, what did we do? So we train about tax obligations. So I talked about this already. The only thing I will add is that we work with the Revenue Authority, and it was actually in our own interest to work with them because it's a part of the world that you don't also want to get in any kind of trouble. So we make sure that the information is consistent, a relatively comprehensive document. And one thing that's important that takes a lot of time to get this message out is a lot of this needs to be done in the local language. These are, average years of schooling in our baseline data is 6 or a little bit less than 6. Right? So the literacy accounting for the quality of our education system, the ability to read and process this information is not there. So we had to train the field workers to do recording. We have them to, okay, can you explain this page to me in Mina? Then they will explain it, we will record it, and then we will play it to a second person, and then the second person will retranslate it in English, and we'll see if we're getting the same thing, right? So we have to do this kind of thing to make sure that we get a consistent message out there for them. So I show you the TPU already. That is a national tax. This page in our document is illustrating some of the municipal taxes, right? And some of them were so shocked to learn things that they should have known for years, that, the size of your signage, to show that, oh, my business is here, the size of it is mapped clearly into how much you pay in taxes. How far you position it from your firm is mapped clearly and how much you pay in taxes, right? So all of these information were things, and whether you actually list the service on it also matter for the rate. So basically, you can say, here's a barber, okay? With the same signage here, your tax bill is different than, here's a barber, we do female, male, and $20 for male, and $15 for female. Right? So when we explained this information, they were really impressed that this is how it actually works. But for them, it's more like, here's a bill, and then I try to beg. Usually what used to be the bargain is I just beg the tax official, you see, I have kids, I haven't made much, this is how it goes. But, so this part, very comprehensive, a lot of work there to get the message out. We train them, follow up, we make sure we are available over the phone to answer their questions. But we have to show this part also, which is, look, we understand that people have a very negative view of the public sector and how some of the public services are run, and end up thinking that the tax money is not working for them. So we thought it's important to show, at least in a neutral way, that here's street lighting, here's the bill for it, for the city of Lome. So we collected these administrative information from the city of Lome. So street lighting, for example, would cost, this is about $2 million US per year, right? So street cleaning, we have also pictures of people cleaning the street and all that. And then we show how much that costs, paying for public officials to sign the documents and all these things, people who are working for the city. So for us, it was important to link this message to the tax collection to even make sense in that particular context. Now, the downside, as an economist, we will want to know what particular dimension of the intervention is driving the finding. But in this particular paper, we didn't care. I would say we didn't care much about that. Really, it's a starting point for us. We wanted to show the fiscal contract, the fiscal contract that is at play, and we thought this was very important to highlight. So we tried to get the numbers and to illustrate that. And I must say, we are not showing this information in any glowing way or in any positive way, right? We're just saying, here's one thing, here's how it cost last year. And then we share that information. Now, somebody can see this and say, why should I be paying for the street lighting? I don't care about that. I want food, I want hospital or something. That is not, we didn't say, oh, the government isn't stealing the money. The government is using the money for street light. That's not what we said, right? So we made sure that this information is relatively neutral. Yes, please. No. Well, you go to the hospital, but oh, you mean whether being formal or non-formal have a bearing in access to some of these health services and all that? Yeah, if you are formal, those who work, for example, for the government have a formal health insurance, for example, right? But this is a tiny portion of the population. This informal sector, which you saw how large it was, if you're sick, you go to the hospital, of course, but you pay, right? Like now the government's working for some basic universal healthcare, but like it will be super basic stuff, right? So you have access to the services like everyone else, but a lot of time you just need to pay. And in the end, as a result of the need to pay, people don't even use these health services. They don't go to hospital when they are sick. They try to figure out at home first, and they go to hospital when it's an emergency. And a lot of time it ends up being too late, unfortunately. So it's not, there's no exclusion whether you are formal or not in terms of accessing education and all that, but those are not free services or readily available everywhere.
Moussa,
Yes.
can I ask a quick question about the size of the barber sign?
Yeah.
This is blowing my mind. So like, so the idea, the rationale behind charging people more for a bigger sign,
Yeah.
is that it's the more successful businesses that are going to have bigger signs. So like the size of their sign is like a proxy for how successful they are, right?
Yeah. So this, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
What I'm saying is like by by revealing this secret to the people, like doesn't it kind of reduce the signal that the size of the sign is supposed to give? And like if I tell everyone like, okay, bigger the sign here is, the bigger your sign is, the more you're gonna have to pay.
Yeah.
And it's the savvy ones, it's the business, it's like the good business owners, who are then gonna have small signs, and it's gonna destroy kind of the signal, or like, you know, the heuristic
Yeah.
that it's supposed to provide in the first place. Is that, am I thinking about it the right way?
Yeah, that is a possibility.
wild.
And you are thinking about it the right way. But I think if I'm a business owner, I want to know this information rather than not knowing it, that I'm being taxed by the size. Now, I don't know that the implication would be, I can see the obvious implication for many of these firms to be like, okay, I reduce the sign, or I don't even put a sign at all if enough people, if I'm keep having the same client all the time, so maybe I don't need a sign. But this is telling you, and again, that's why I'm talking about the fact that for us, we see this as a research program. It's a bigger picture issue that we are doing, how to engage with this sector, this segment of the population, because the states are engaging with them. So we need to figure out how to improve that engagement. In this particular case, yes, I can see a reason why we might not want to. We might want the people sitting around the table. I can't tell you they're too rational. The people sitting around the table formulating these tax law, they have a reason. I suspect that is the same reason that you're talking about, because I think everywhere, if you have a giant sign, you pay more. You know, during elections or stuff like that, you probably pay more if it's a bigger poster, right? But in this particular case, I think there are good reasons why, as a state, you might want to be much more lenient and relaxed on how you approach taxing this aspect of the economy. Yeah, Yeah, but I hear you. That's what it is. So we train and test field workers. All of them will have a minimum of a bachelor degree. The good thing well, not a good thing, bad thing. In some of this part of the world is due to high unemployment. You have a lot of high skilled people who would unfortunately do this temporary. So we were able to get quite skilled people, some of them even studying in economics and accounting, who were able to work with us. So we have to use the local language. The good thing in the capital city also is that even the people who are not from that local language that is dominant in the capital city end up speaking it, because you live there and everyone speaks it. They speak it even in the government offices. So we didn't have to do multiple languages. So we trained the firm, distributed the document, follow up 30 days later with individual consultation. This is no longer like the kind of training in group, but we go and sit with them in their specific business and ask, okay, in your specific case, what are you thinking about in terms of your next tax bill, how you processing the information we share with you. And then we made sure that at the Center for Research and Opinion Polls, where the research was hosted, that there is someone there with a cell phone that can answer questions if any of those call. But we do also occasionally just call them and say, okay, it's us. You have any question for us, right? So this is some of our field workers. What they hold in here is what is maps of enumeration areas. Because we don't have a sampling frame, and we wouldn't have had a sampling frame even if we were working for a formal firm. We just had the first census of firm in the country just recently, right? So we use an Afrobarometer methodology, and that methodology consists of a randomly picking starting point, and then you go to that starting point and you go in the 4 different directions, and every other firm or every other 5th firm in our case will be included in our sample. And this map that they are using, if you want to see how in practice it will look like, I can show it to you later, but we have the complete mapping of the city that is divided equal side territorially, and these are the printout of the 62 randomly selected part of the city. In the office, we select the starting point, then they have to go to that starting point, and 4 people go in 4 different directions to then collect every other 5th economic entity that they encounter.
Were firms willing to participate, or how were refusing?
Oh yeah, so that was a part we were surprised. I mean, it's 100%, in part because what we needed to convince them is that we are not working for the government. And it wasn't very hard for us because so the center where this research was based is a think tank that, a couple of friends and I set up 12 years ago now in the country. It has super great reputation in the country, in part because we were also lucky to be selected as a Afrobarometer partner in the country. So very high prominence and people know us. Right? So we went as the center, not as the government. And they've seen the center come out with results talking about big issues that a lot of people don't talk about, including, okay, how corrupt the public sector is, how corrupt even the president or the judicial system and all that. So there was no chance they would
partner with the government.
There wasn't that. So we were able to get a good participation there. Now I will spare you this because this is a very simple paper, but in the paper we use a firm characteristic, owner's characteristic, both add some fixed effects or whatever to ensure that the observable characteristic in our data does not explain the treatment assignment. And with that, we make a projection that, in theory, given that we are the one who did the randomization, we can expect that even on the basis of unobservable, for which we don't have data, that they will be balanced, and then we'll have a causal interpretation of the coefficient that we would estimate as a result of that. So what I will show you would be this very simple equation, and where we will add, the baseline outcome variable and a couple of baseline variable to gain more precision in our estimate, because again, we also have limited resources. Part of our sample size were informed by how much money we're able to spend on the study. I will also show later some estimate of local treatment effect, and the take-up variable here will refer to the firms whose knowledge actually have improved. And the expectation is that if it's working through our intervention, so these local treatment effects should be larger because these are firms actually that are impacted by our training. Then I will also later show some suggest some exploratory analysis trying to pin down how maybe the mechanism works. So first of all, is to show that they know better now about the tax code, from being able to correctly identify the national taxes, to be aware of the signage taxes, to know the factors that matter for tax burden. So on all of these fronts, you will see in column 1, for example, that we move from a control mean of 6% to adding 23% of who are able to identify that. Now, this is not miraculously getting 80% of them to know these things, because again, this is the first time a lot of them are actually learning this. But now we're talking about maybe nearly 30% in our control group who know at least what the tax professional unit is. Right. In the second column, it was even worse, 2% and then we get 24% more by testing them whether they actually process this information. So the first part is to document that there's been some impact on the knowledge. Then from there we look at the impact on tax participation, and the first column is the equation that I've shown you, the basic average treatment effect, and then the other column is where we are adding the baseline measure of the outcome and a couple of baseline outcome variable. So in the first column, we get about 9 percentage point decrease in the overall participation. And you can see that the mean in the control group remain identical to our baseline average, which was, I think, 40%, and now it's 41%. It's basically the same number. So 9 percentage point out of 41 or so is like some 22, 23% increase. But you can see that the coefficient here is significant only at the 10% level. And then so when we add baseline control variable, the coefficient stabilize around 13 percentage point. Normally it shouldn't change, but this is small sample statistics we're doing. As much as we want to use the law of large number, we're always confronted with the small sample issues. So we conclude from this table that we can think about the extensive margin going down somewhere from 9 to 13% percentage point, because the rest are significant at the 1% level. Then when we look at the heterogeneity, which is the only dimension really we thought about from the beginning, which is the firm, depending on the size of the firm, whether this would matter. So when you look at the heterogeneity along the revenue line, here also we had to adjust the revenue by the firm size. That's why this is called the ratio of revenue to replacement asset value of the firm, because otherwise larger firm likely to just make more revenue. But the spirit of the taxation is supposed to be sort of proportional to how much they're making given within their own category. So when we look at that, you could see that the general tendency is that higher revenue firms are more likely to participate. And later I will show that this higher revenue firm actually, now this was like follow-up analysis for the mechanism. They are actually more likely to self-declare. So they learn they can self-declare, they just go and they declare it so that they even avoid having to be confronted with the tax official. So that's the second layer. Now, the intent, the local treatment effect is confirming what we had in mind when we're now looking at the effect on these firms that learn from this more local average effect. So this reconfort us that the effect is operating through that is operating through the intervention that we run. So from there, yes.
I mean, so let's see if I'm interpreting this well. So this could be bribes as well. So this is the people in the firms saying whether they pay tax.
Yes.
They pay the tax collector.
Yeah.
So people could confuse paying taxes with paying tax collector, right? So in that sense, I mean, I take this as something nice, because maybe these guys at the bottom, they are being explored by tax collectors, and now they are less explored by tax collectors. They are paying something more. They don't show much for assets and so on. So before tax collectors, maybe they were making a big deal of their position, and now you have less.
Yes.
So is the right way to interpret?
That's the way we are interpreting it. That's the way we interpret it. We think a lot of these firms, especially the low revenue firm, were being abuse. Now we can't tell for sure. Although we did have some precision to not confuse paying bribe with paying taxes. But I cannot guarantee that because again, when we asked for the receipt, I told you how we had a large number of non-responders. They don't have the receipt. Now, some of them said the receipt is, you can expect some of them to have the receipt right there where they are working. It's not a place, there's no storage place and stuff like that. So that's fine. But it's also possible that many of them paid a bribe instead of an actual tax. So they may also pay a bribe without knowing, because this is not a part of the world where people pay something and say, where is my receipt? You know, like people want to pay and get out of that situation. And it's possible that the tax authority come and say, okay, it's $20, and then they bargain, and then it end up being $7. He takes the $7 and goes. In the perspective of the firm, they think they just paid their taxes. And in the perspective of the tax collector, they just collected a bribe. That is actually a likely possibility, because they're not going to ask the receipt. Nobody's going to come back and ask them, where is your receipt really?
If I can add something, it's actually double good news in the following sense. So if, as you go to larger firms, it's more likely that people don't confuse bribes with tax collection. It's actually even better, because the higher tax, the larger firms are paying more taxes now.
Yes, exactly.
So it's likely that they are actually paying those taxes.
Exactly. If it's large, it's likely to be a tax, and it's likely that you will ask. Actually, you are more likely to ask it.
Evidence of whether small firms confuse more and larger firms confuse less.
So what we can do is to check a correlation between those who gave us receipt and their revenue.
Yeah,
that's what we could do, right? We didn't think about that before. But if we knew what you just said, because we went back for intensive qualitative work, we could have learned this also, because we did have some candid conversation with a lot of them, right? And this is something we should look into going forward.
I mean, are there some, when you ask them for the receipt, do some of them report an amount that's different from the receipt?
If they reported an amount that's different from the receipt?
Yeah.
No, we didn't. So if there is a receipt, we just report what is on the receipt. We didn't have 2-column amounts, declare an amount on the receipt. Okay. We had a receipt or not, and basically that are tied to one single amount. That was a mistake our part, even though we were going for the second time to the field. But these things we are also learning as we progress, right? So now this is the part where we don't have very good data. When we were looking at the revenue, so the first two blocks, the revenue, column 1 and 2 is looking at the firm's revenue, very noisy, right? Like, it's not like they're keeping any track of anything they're really doing.
Self-reported totally.
Yeah. Completely self-reported, highly noisy. The one we trust the most is column 3 and 4. In column 3 and 4, we show up, we say, okay, how many orders are you working on right now? Like, if you are a carpenter, how many table, bed, or anything that you are working on right now? And we're able to verify that. And that is what is happening on that very day of the survey. Now, this also has its own challenge depending on which day you showed up, but there's no reason for us to have shown up on good days in the treatment. And I mean, we had a relatively large number of enumerators, and then we don't do first treatment and then control, but it's more like by enumeration areas that we use to go, right? So when we look at that, we have a good sign that there were more order in the treatment group and the positive treatment effect. The tax amount paid also shows some significant effect, but we don't want to put much weight on it because, again, we don't have good data. There could be a lot of fishy thing going on. But what we are able to do that we are working on a little bit right now is to try to look at different estimate of the distribution of the revenues, which is highly skewed to the left, and try to see, if you were looking at this. I think Jonathan and with a few quarters have some papers, a recent paper that gave us that idea that they're looking at extensive versus intensive margin. For us, it's not going to be exactly extensive versus intensive margin. It's just going to be, okay, let's say you ignore completely 70% of the low revenue firm, but then you're able to raise high revenue firm collection rate from maybe, I don't know, 20% to 27%. How much are you losing? Basically, we can do that. This will be a theoretical exercise that we're doing, but that would allow us, together with this, to say at least something, even that in the perspective of government, under some condition, it may be better to allocate resources toward those who are really making money and bigger and all that. So I think you wanted to weigh, yeah.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna ask, you mentioned that the only people whose revenues are below 30 million CFA francs are the ones who are subject to this tax regime.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Is there, I'm like, are there enough people in your sample who are close to that?
30 million?
Yeah.
No, and that's what I was also saying. Like,
Okay, so
vast majority, like not even close.
okay, so like bunching at that threshold is not an outcome that makes sense.
No, no, it wouldn't make sense. We were thinking about that. A very nice. I mean, especially we're talking to the tax authority to see if they can open up their data a little bit.
Yeah.
That's one of the things we will want to look at. In fact, that part became even more interesting. I'll show you in a minute what happened, because they did a reform after we did this study and work with them. I mean, I won't, no claim at all that this has any impact on their reform, but I'll show you what they did.
Cool.
Yes, please.
Minor comment on the practical one. Practical one is we have 10 minutes.
Yes.
More or less.
Yeah.
A minor comment was on current orders. Do you have any information that these orders are about the same value? Because they could not, I mean, I don't have any reason to believe that this should be different between treatment and control. It could be that there could be some maybe capacity constraints. You get the big order, you don't accept any other. I mean, how good is this indicator? Can you maybe say some more to strengthen this for us?
Yeah. So unfortunately, we don't have we didn't
for the
think about the
example that you're thinking about. I mean, it could be different that we're doing like a small thing or a big thing.
Yeah. So I think we can play with the data in terms of looking at the heterogeneity. But the other thing we did in our sample for the study is that we started with over 600 firms, and we tried to create a little bit of homogeneity in terms of so that we don't have a widely different profession. So this will be dominated by barbers, sewers, tailors, mechanics, that name I've never been able to say that. Those who in French is les soudeurs. Okay, so we have a little bit of homogeneity, but I hear your point. Like, not all orders are the same. In the ideal world, we wanted to document the value of each order so that we can then infer on that spot.
Yeah, or say something about their homogeneity.
Yeah. So we could say something on the homogeneity. So I'm going to skip a couple of slides here, but the point we try to make in the rest of the paper is to try to see if our theory of change going in on empowerment is what is at play here. But of course, we didn't design experiments itself, and we don't have even the resources to be able to create enough treatment arm to elicit that. So we're looking at these as more exploratory analysis. But we had to rule out that, for example, contamination play a role. For example, that maybe anything could be happening. But for us, it's easy for us just looking at the treatment, the control group at the baseline, at the end line. There's no change at all in the share in terms of participation. There could be increased corrupt practices. We discussed that in the paper, but we showed that the intervention itself did not correlate, has any effect on corrupt practices. People may have also learned about the cost of non-compliance being low. In fact, even in the developed world, I'm not sure that the government actually want everyone to know the chance of getting away with not paying your taxes, which is quite higher than most people would think, because in recent reform in the US, the Biden administration is trying to increase massively, like hire more than 80,000 IRS officials. That tells you how much is not going on. So even after analyzing the end line, we went back and talked to some 120 firms. Some are like in-depth focus group discussion. We stratified this sample in a way that we have people who paid before, didn't pay after, paid before and after. You know, these 4 groups were split along the treatment and the control. And the overall big picture of is that we have supporting evidence that these firms were able to stand the tax officials, that they are more being part of the treatment group empowers the firm to be able to, even when they encounter the tax official, to be able to claim their right. I'm going to skip this slide. I want to show you this table where you could see, for example, condition to a visit by a tax official, 80% payment in the control group, 38% only in the treatment group. And you will see also the revenue, the average revenue is quite high for those who are actually paying, even though that number is dropping. So these exploratory analysis altogether, what we draw as a lesson is that we have some supporting evidence that, okay, they learn about the tax code and maybe they hide less because that's what we see here, even when the tax official shows up, there's more confidence. And you could also expect them to plan better, to even know, even those who are paying their taxes, knowing that my bill is likely to be this amount, makes a big difference if you understand some of the challenges that we have on the financial inclusion aspect as well. It's not like they have a bank account where they can save and plan. So when the tax official shows up, this tax bill is usually what they made around that time when they are meeting the tax official, because a lot of them, again, what they are making on the day-to-day basis is barely enough for them to sustain themselves and their families, right? So, so it's important to get that information right to them. So we, in a nutshell, we thought there is a room to get that information out there about the tax code to the general public. Our tax code is basically, not even the basics, right? Like not even the basics is known out there to these firms. And I think it's very important to get that knowledge out, and that could even generate discussion about how they are being taxed. Because this tax rate or the process of taxing this sector is done behind closed offices. And if people were discussing about how you pay taxes based on, putting a sign for your business, people could bring that up as part of, maybe political debate in election or in engaging with the public official that, I can't even put a sign now for my business, or, so having that information out in itself matters beyond even the revenue mobilization dimension. So what does this mean? If you take these our finding face value, so you will want some simplification of the tax rules, and I think most countries will want that. But in this particular case, because these people have lower capacity, low skill, and it's particularly important that the information be digestible to them. Taking some initiative to educate, limit the discretion of the tax collector. Maybe fixed payment could be one aspect. Ghana is using fixed payments and it has its own problems, super aggressive. And in fact, what I wanted to show you is that they did a reform, after this study was completed. And in the new reform, now they remove the discretion that the tax official have. I mean, they nearly removed it, right? And I'll show you how they did that. They're now saying, okay, they raised the bar for the informal. Now it has to be 60 million, but then they split it in two. Above 30 million, but below 60 million, you have to declare. It's no longer optional, okay? You have to declare. If you are below 30 million, you are still in the category for our study, right? But now they are saying that it's going to be a regime called forfaitaire. Forfaitaire means it's going to be a fixed amount. So if you're making between 0 and 5,000 US dollars, you pay $40. So there's no quibbling trying to figure out how much you made, trying to estimate what is your revenue. But of course, you can see the problem also being that if you make $100, you pay $40. If you make $5,000, you also pay $40. It's regressive. So this now become even more interesting for the bunching analysis that you were mentioning, because without this low cutoff, there's no meaningful opportunity to study whether people are at the bunching around this amount, 60 million or 30 million, 30 million US dollars. You're not going to see much action going there, right? So then, okay, from 5,000 to 10,000, quite a big amount, 370 US dollars, and these are revenue per year, right? These are really small economic activities, so they're struggling to find a way to tax them, and this is very recent reform that they did that then deals with, and the reason I say it deals with that discussion, because I think I can check that later. Maybe nearly 100% of our firm would fall somewhere here, never more than this, right? So that means there won't be enough opportunity to discuss whether you are here or here, right? Like, so that's the point. But what we are thinking about more is that there is a broader implication here for us to think about the overall engagement with that large segment of the economy. I mentioned already how when we presented this work in South Africa, I was made aware of how they decided to exempt them and actually have a supportive approach. So the state is approaching them as how can I help you grow and all that. And you can think about, even if you're not taxing them, you can think about that as a social transfer. Right? Like you could have taxed them and give them some money, but you could also just let them alone. That's the approach that I saw recently. One of my former colleague and friend at the World Bank was appointed the Minister of Economy and Planning in Angola, Mario, and I saw one of his first announcement was like he's going to formalize, I guess, 200,000 informal firm every year for the next many years. So that is their approach there. Like this formalization is quite attractive when you think about it, especially with the digitization. People think they can still do it, but it's a much more complicated stuff. Right? In Ghana, they're using stamps to tax that sector. So the overall point that I think we have to pay attention to is that it's not an homogeneous sector. You have very low level economic activity, subsistence level, and engagement with the state is important, maybe even more for institutional and social contract than the revenue generation part. And we have to think about ways in which we can enhance that engagement. And that's the big takeaway that we want to carry with us. And I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity again to share this with you. And yeah, that's what I had for you today.
Thank you very much for this enlightening talk. I think we are out of time, so we'll thank you and leave questions maybe first. Okay, thank you very much.